My husband betrayed me, and after we divorced, he caused the tragic death of our daughter in a car accident while his stepdaughter covered up the truth. It's hard to put into words the feeling of betrayal. It's not just about the lies or the broken promises. It's realizing, too late, that you were never truly seen. For many years, I lived under the assumption that my husband loved me, that our life together was built on trust, honesty, and respect. But all of that changed one morning when I found myself standing alone in the hospital, clutching my broken wrist, wondering how everything could have fallen apart so quickly. That morning started like any other. I was simply reaching up to grab a glass from the top shelf, doing nothing unusual, when a sharp pain shot up my arm. My grip slipped and the glass shattered. The pain was immediate and unbearable. I couldn't even move my fingers. Jason, my husband, was lounging on the couch, absorbed in his phone, not even noticing. I could barely say anything. "Jason, I think I sprained my wrist," I said, my voice choking, trying not to show the pain. Without even looking up, he just brushed me off. "Put some ice on it. You'll be fine," he replied indifferently. I didn't argue. This wasn't the first time he had ignored my concerns, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I wanted to ask him to take me to the hospital, but I knew that would just annoy him. Finally, after some back and forth, he agreed. But instead of showing concern, all I could feel was his frustration. He sighed and drove, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. I asked him if he could take me to the emergency room, and he sighed again. The drive should have taken only a few minutes. We were just a few minutes away from the hospital. But everything changed when his phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was Laura, his ex-wife. I froze. I didn't know if it was a coincidence or if something deeper was going on. But the shift in his attitude was immediate. Jason's voice softened as he answered the call, the irritation vanishing entirely. My stomach twisted. "Sarah, get out of the car," he said suddenly. I blinked. "What? Are you seriously asking me to get out right now? We're only 2 minutes away from the hospital." His face was cold and indifferent. "I have business to take care of. You can walk." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been married to this man for 15 years, and now he was telling me to get out of the car over a simple hospital visit. My wrist ached, but I paused, feeling the weight of his indifference. This wasn't just about my wrist, it was everything. I had been living in an illusion, convincing myself that everything was fine. But in that moment, standing on the side of the road, I knew. I wasn't just dealing with a physical injury. I was facing a man who clearly didn't respect me. I stepped out of the car and watched as he drove off without a second glance. The sun felt as though it was pressing down on me. Each step I took like a heavy weight, pulling me further into a pit of frustration and despair. The heat was unbearable, but it wasn't just the scorching weather that drained me. It was the feeling that I was walking through the motions of life with no one to lean on. My wrist throbbed with every step, a dull ache that mirrored the growing pain in my chest. It should have been a simple injury, probably nothing more than a sprain, but the way Jason had dismissed me, it was like that small, insignificant pain was a reflection of everything else he had done to me over the years. I had always been able to convince myself that everything was fine, that our marriage was just going through a rough patch. But today, as I limped my way to the hospital, it became crystal clear. This wasn't just about the pain in my wrist. It was about a man who had stopped caring. It was about being ignored, dismissed, and abandoned by someone I had trusted with my life. The walk felt like a lifetime. My wrist, the only part of my body that seemed to matter in that moment, sent waves of burning pain up my arm with every step. I tried not to let it affect me, to focus on getting to the hospital. But every stride felt like a reminder of how alone I was. How alone I had always been, even when I thought I wasn't. I arrived at the hospital an hour later, drenched in sweat, my legs shaking beneath me. It wasn't just the heat, it was everything: Jason's indifference, my own helplessness. The cold tile of the hospital floor seemed to freeze my heart as I hobbled in. Clutching my wrist, nurses glanced at me, their eyes sharp, but they didn't speak. Just another person to pass through the revolving door of the emergency room. I could almost feel their judgment. Not for my injury, but for the fact that I had come here alone, like no one was waiting for me, no one cared. They asked the usual questions, took my information, and handed me the paperwork to fill out. It all felt mechanical, like I was just another form, another case for them to check off. No warmth, no care. I wanted to scream, to demand someone show me the kindness I had never received from Jason, but I knew it wouldn't matter. It would only make me seem like I was asking for attention, something I had learned to avoid doing years ago. I sat there in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, staring at my phone. My hand clutched it desperately, hoping for some sign that Jason cared, that he was thinking of me. that he would reach out. Maybe he was just caught up in something, maybe he had simply forgotten. But the screen remained blank. No calls. No messages. Nothing. The silence in the waiting room was deafening. The world outside moved on and I was left in this suffocating bubble of isolation. It wasn't the injury that hurt the most. It was the realization that I was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. A burden. It was a hard pill to swallow. This truth that had been simmering under the surface for years, but had never truly sunk in until now. Jason had driven me to the hospital, if you could even call it that, and then just left me there. He hadn't even bothered to check if I had made it, if I was okay. It wasn't just the neglect in that moment, it was the cumulative years of small, cruel acts of indifference that added up to this monumental feeling of abandonment. I couldn't stop the tears, though they weren't for the injury. No, they were for the pain in my heart. For the realization that my marriage was a lie. Jason had stopped loving me long before this morning, but I had refused to see it. I had closed my eyes to the truth, convincing myself that things would change, that he would come around. But now, sitting there in that cold hospital room, I knew. It was over. The doctor came in after what seemed like an eternity. His voice was clinical, detached, as though he were discussing something trivial. A sprain. A minor fracture. Nothing serious. He told me I would need a brace, and to avoid using it for a few weeks. I nodded, but none of it registered. It wasn't the injury that overwhelmed me. It was the emotional collapse that I was too afraid to admit to myself. This wasn't just about a broken wrist. It was about the years of broken trust, of shattered dreams, of a love that had slowly faded until it was nothing but a distant echo in the back of my mind. The brace felt heavy on my wrist, but it was nothing compared to the weight on my heart. Jason wasn't here, and he never would be. Not really. That realization felt like a crushing blow, the kind that leaves you gasping for air. Like the world around you has just tilted off its axis. The physical pain was nothing in comparison. It was a bruise that would heal with time. The emotional scars, however, would take much longer. And as I sat there in the sterile hospital room, I finally allowed myself to face the truth. Jason wasn't coming back. And even if he did, it wouldn't matter. Because in that moment, I realized that I didn't need him. I was stronger than I had ever known. This was the beginning of something new. The end of the life I had built with him. And the start of a new chapter, one where I could finally learn to live for myself. But in that moment, it still hurt. More than I had ever imagined. The pain of rejection. The pain of knowing that no matter how much I had given, it would never be enough. It wasn't just a broken wrist. It was the broken pieces of a life I had tried to hold together for far too long. The days that followed were a blur, a tangled mess of hospital visits and frantic thoughts about what was happening with Jason. My wrist was healing, but my mind, my heart was a mess. I kept replaying everything over and over in my head, his indifference, his neglect, his complete emotional withdrawal. The truth was clear now, but there was still this constant ache inside me. A gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something more than just the surface betrayal. But it wasn't until Melanie, my stepdaughter, came to visit that the full weight of the situation really began to sink in. Melanie and I had always shared a close bond. She was like a daughter to me, and I had always tried to be there for her in ways that Jason never was. But when she came to see me that afternoon, there was something different about her. Attention I couldn't place. First, I attributed it to the stress of everything that had been happening. Maybe she was just concerned for me. But as we talked, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. There was something in the way she avoided eye contact, something in the way she was carefully choosing her words. And then, as though she couldn't hold it in any longer, she blurted it out. Jason had been seeing someone else. The words hit me like a slap to the face, but it wasn't entirely a surprise. A part of me had known, had sensed that something was off. The late nights? The secretive behavior, the way he had started to pull away from me emotionally long before the injury. But hearing it from Melanie, the confirmation, it felt like everything inside me shattered in that moment. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to spin around me. He had been sneaking around behind my back, pretending everything was fine, playing the role of a husband while lying to me for months. All the signs had been there, but I had ignored them. I had convinced myself that things would get better, that he would return to me, to us. But now, the truth was right in front of me and there was no denying it. What hurt more than the words themselves was the realization that I had been living in a lie for so long. Jason had never even bothered to make an effort. He hadn't even tried to make it seem like he cared. All this time I had given him everything, but he had been slipping away, choosing to invest his energy into someone else, someone who wasn't me. And when I confronted him about it, I saw the coldness in his eyes. He was indifferent, like he didn't care at all. He told me I was overreacting, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. It was like he couldn't even be bothered to admit what was so plainly in front of him. The hurt, the pain, it didn't matter to him. All that mattered was his own comfort, his own self-preservation. In that moment, I realized just how little I meant to him. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything. The emotional neglect, the broken promises, the years of pretending. And now, after everything, after all the sacrifices I had made for him, for our family, he was just gone. The worst part was how easily he had dismissed me, how easily he had moved on. As though I was just some passing inconvenience in his life. But Melanie wasn't the only one who had seen it. My daughters, Emily and Chloe, had also started to notice. They had sensed the growing distance between Jason and me, the way he had stopped coming home on time, the way he had started making excuses for why he couldn't spend time with them. They saw the change too. They saw their mother being abandoned, not just by Jason, but by someone who had promised to love and protect me. And they didn't know how to process it. As I sat there, I was no longer the woman who stood by him, who supported him, who built a life with him. I was nothing more than a distant memory to him, something he had left behind. And it hurt. More than I could ever put into words. It hurt to realize that everything I had believed in, everything I had built with him, had been a lie. Jason had moved on with Laura. The woman who had always loomed over our relationship like a shadow. She had never truly gone away, had she? She had always been there, lurking in the background, even after their divorce. And now, after all these years, she was the one who had his attention, while I was left to pick up the pieces of a broken marriage. He had moved on with her. And I was left to try and figure out how to pick up the shattered remains of my own life. The weight of it all was crushing, and yet, in some twisted way, I felt relief. Relief because, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to keep pretending. The truth was out. The lies, the deceit, the false promises. They were all laid bare. And now, I could finally begin to see things clearly. The fog that had clouded my judgment for so long was starting to lift, and in its place was a new clarity. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how I would rebuild my life or what steps I needed to take next. But one thing was for certain. I was done being his fool. I was done pretending that everything was okay. Jason had made his choice, and I had to make mine. It was time for me to stop living in the past and start looking toward the future. The weeks that followed were a blur. A constant cycle of numbness and a creeping sense of dread. Jason had grown even more distant. As though he had already detached himself from everything that we once had. I couldn't even pinpoint when it had happened, but I felt the distance between us widening with each passing day. It was as though he had simply moved on. As if he had turned a page in the story of our lives and was now ready to start a new chapter. And there I was, stuck on the same page, unable to move forward. Unable to escape the echoes of the past. Every conversation we had, every look he gave me reminded me that I wasn't the person he had once loved. I wasn't the woman he had promised to stand by. To protect. That person, she had been replaced. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I could move on too, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. It wasn't until one cold, gray morning that everything became clear. I found myself sitting in a lawyer's office, staring at the divorce papers in front of me. The room felt suffocating. The walls closing in. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper too loud in the silence of my thoughts. This was it. This was the moment I had been both dreading and yearning for. The end of the life I had known. The end of a marriage that had slowly withered away beneath the weight of betrayal, indifference, and unspoken resentments. I had spent so many nights in turmoil, wondering if I was making the right choice, if I could somehow salvage what little remained of our relationship. But now as I sat there, signing my name, I realized something that I hadn't fully grasped before. I was free. I was free from the constant heartache. From the suffocating weight of trying to fix something that was never going to be whole again. For the first time in years, I wasn't making a decision based on someone else's happiness or needs. I was making a decision for myself. And that in itself was a feeling I had forgotten. The finality of it hit me all at once, a wave of emotion that left me breathless. It was as if the entire weight of the past few months, maybe even the entire course of our marriage, had been lifted off my shoulders. Jason didn't fight me. He didn't argue or beg me to reconsider. He simply walked away, just like that. He left me with the house, my dignity, and my freedom. But somehow that wasn't enough. Even though the papers were signed, even though the divorce was final, I still felt as though I was trapped in the past. His absence didn't feel like relief, it felt like an empty void. I thought about the years we had spent together, the hopes, the dreams, the promises that had been made and broken. I thought about the woman I had been, the woman who had trusted him with everything, who had believed in us, in our future. That woman felt so far away now, like a ghost in the distance. And though I had gotten everything I thought I wanted, freedom, there was still a deep, gnawing ache inside me. It was the ache of loss, of love unreturned, of time wasted. It was the realization that no matter how hard I tried to move forward, a part of me would always remain tethered to the past, to the version of myself that was intertwined with Jason. In the days after the divorce, there was a strange sense of quiet. The house was empty, not just of Jason, but of the life we had built together. There was no more tension, no more anger. But there was also no peace. I didn't know how to be alone. I didn't know how to live without him, without the life I had once imagined we would have. The silence was deafening. There was no longer any pretense. No more pretending that things were okay. No more hiding from the truth that had been there all along. As the weeks went by, I began to realize that my journey wasn't about moving on from Jason. It was about moving on from the person I had been. The woman who had been so lost in a broken marriage that she had forgotten how to live for herself. I was starting over, not just with a clean slate, but with a whole new understanding of who I was and what I deserved. But even with that realization, I couldn't help but feel the sting of regret. Regret that I had allowed myself to stay for so long. Regret that I had believed in a man who could never truly love me the way I deserved. Regret that I had sacrificed so much of myself for someone who would never give me the same in return. The divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something else. Something raw and uncertain. It was the end of one chapter and the start of another. But the process of healing, of rebuilding, was slow. There were days when I couldn't shake the memories, when the weight of everything we had been through felt like it would crush me. But there were also days when I felt a flicker of hope. Days when I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by Jason, by the lies, by the broken promises. For the first time, I was beginning to believe that I could find happiness on my own. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. And I knew it wouldn't come all at once. Healing would take time. Rebuilding would take time. But I was ready. Ready to stop living in the shadows of the past. Ready to start building a future that was mine and mine alone. Then the unthinkable happened. Chloe, my youngest daughter, was gone. Just like that. In the blink of an eye. It felt as though the world had suddenly flipped upside down and I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Chloe, the vibrant girl who brought so much joy into our home, the one who made me laugh when everything seemed impossible, was dead. A car accident, they said. And yet, for all the pain that surged through my body, for all the grief that I felt pulling me under, there was a part of me that refused to believe it. It was too sudden, too senseless. It didn't make sense that my sweet daughter, who still had so much life to live, was gone forever. At first, I thought it was just a tragic, random event. An accident. A horrible stroke of fate. How could I have known any better? The police reports were clear. The details were straightforward. It was just another one of those awful things that happen in life. A young girl struck by a car while walking home with friends. The world seemed to stop and I was consumed by the pain of losing her. I clung to the idea that this was just some unfortunate incident. Something beyond anyone's control. But as the days went on, and the fog of grief began to lift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The questions lingered, slowly gnawing at my mind. Why wasn't Jason at the scene? Why did no one seem to know who had been driving? Why did the situation seem so quiet? No one was asking the right questions. I began to dig deeper. I called Chloe's friends. I asked around the neighborhood. I searched for answers that seemed to slip through my fingers no matter how hard I tried to hold on. And then, the truth began to emerge. Slowly, painfully, the pieces started to fall into place. My heart sank as I realized the truth I had been dreading all along. Jason, my ex-husband, the man I had once loved, the father of my children, had been the one behind the wheel. He had been the one driving the car that had struck my daughter. At first, I couldn't believe it. My brain refused to process the information, refusing to let the truth sink in. Jason, the man who had left me, who had been so cold and indifferent to everything we had shared, the man who had already betrayed me in the worst way imaginable? He was the one who had killed our daughter? It felt like someone had ripped out my heart and stomped on it over and over again. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be true. Jason had always been reckless, always too focused on his own needs to care for anyone else. But this was too much. This was unforgivable. But as the truth sank in, a deep rage began to bubble up inside me. I couldn't just sit back and allow this to happen. Jason thought he could get away with everything, the betrayal, the lies, and now, the death of our daughter. But I wasn't going to let him. Not this time. He had already taken so much from me. My trust, my dignity, my marriage. But he was not going to get away with Chloe's death. I would make sure of it. I found out that Melanie, my stepdaughter, had known all along. She had known that Jason had been the one driving that night, and she had kept quiet. She was scared. Terrified of what Jason would do to her if she spoke out, terrified that he would hurt her, too, if she told the truth. I understood her fear, but it didn't matter anymore. Chloe was gone. And I needed to make sure Jason paid for what he had done. The guilt and shame that Melanie carried with her was palpable, but I couldn't let that stop me. Chloe was my daughter. My responsibility. Jason had destroyed our family, and now he had taken Chloe from me. I had to make sure that someone held him accountable for his actions. No one else was going to do it. The police had their reports, but the case had already been swept under the rug. Jason was too well connected, too much of a smooth talker, to let this be the end of it. But I couldn't stand by and watch him get away with murder. Not this time. I gathered the courage to speak out, to demand justice, even though it felt like my insides were crumbling with every word I spoke. I contacted the authorities, told them everything I knew, everything I had uncovered. I couldn't rest until Jason was held responsible for what he had done. I couldn't let my daughter's death be just another statistic. Another tragic story buried in the background. The legal system was slow, frustrating, and painful to navigate, but I wasn't going to back down. Jason thought he could bury this, just like he had buried everything else. But he was wrong. This time, I would make sure he paid for his crimes. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, whether he liked it or not. As I fought for justice, I felt a strange sense of determination settle within me. For all the pain I was feeling, for all the heartbreak and rage, I knew I couldn't let Chloe's death be in vain. I couldn't let Jason walk away without facing what he had done. Not when I had lost everything. Not when my daughter's life had been taken so senselessly, so violently. I would make sure the truth came out, no matter how hard it was. Jason would not get away with this. Not on my watch. The story didn't end with the shocking truth about Chloe's death, nor with the punishment I had imagined. In fact, everything I had believed to be the conclusion was merely the beginning of something much darker. The truth, as it always does, twisted and turned in unexpected ways, revealing new horrors I had never anticipated. I couldn't just sit still and watch life pass by, especially when I realized the heartbreaking truth. Melanie, my stepdaughter, the one person I had trusted, had helped conceal the facts. And Jason, my ex-husband, was still finding ways to avoid responsibility, just like he always had. The weight of this new revelation crushed me in ways I hadn't prepared for. Melanie, the daughter I had helped raise, the girl I had treated as my own, was not the innocent victim I had assumed. She was complicit. She had known, and instead of doing the right thing, she stayed silent. The guilt that had festered inside her for weeks was something I couldn't overlook, and it gnawed at me, pulling at the very fabric of what I thought our family was. It was like everything had been a lie. When I confronted Melanie about that night, about everything she knew, the walls she had carefully built around herself came crashing down. She cried, sobbed in a way that felt almost like an apology, but not quite. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the hurt, the shame, but it didn't change the fact that she had kept quiet. She had let Chloe's death be buried under the weight of fear and loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it. Jason had been her father for years, but he was nothing more than a man who manipulated her into silence, using his power over her as a weapon. Melanie explained everything. Her voice was shaky, each word coming out as if it were torn from her. Jason called me that night, she said, her voice cracking. He said he wanted to talk to me. I didn't think much of it. But then he took me for a walk. And then we saw Chloe, Mom. I froze. The room around me seemed to close in as her words hung in the air. The weight of the truth settled on me like a ton of bricks. She had witnessed the accident, the moment when Chloe's life was taken, but she had stayed silent. She had known what happened, and yet she chose not to speak up. I stared at Melanie, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. She didn't stop, did she? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My eyes were locked on her, searching for some sign that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But deep down I already knew the answer. Melanie nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes as she choked on the words that followed. He was afraid that if we called the police, he'd lose everything. I was scared, Mom. If I spoke out, he would abandon me. We didn't know what to do. Her voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to shatter what little was left of my trust in her. A sense of discomfort surged inside me, a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how much I wanted to. The betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. Jason had always been selfish, always too consumed with his own desires to care about anyone else. But this was something new. He hadn't just lied. He had taken a life. And Melanie had known. She had helped cover it up. Out of fear, out of loyalty to a man who had never treated her like family but had manipulated her into silence. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any hurt he had ever caused me. Jason thought he could escape it all. He thought he could control the narrative as he always had, manipulate everyone around him to protect himself. He had done it for years, lying, cheating, hiding behind his charm, his smooth words. But this time he had gone too far. This wasn't just about lies. This was about a life being taken, about my daughter's future being stolen from her. And I wasn't going to let him walk away from this. Not without facing the consequences of his actions. Not without paying for what he had done. As much as I understood Melanie's fear, as much as I could empathize with the pressure she had been under, I couldn't let her silence be justified. Chloe was gone. My daughter. The daughter I had raised, loved, and protected. And no matter how much pain I felt from her betrayal, I knew I had to stand up for Chloe. I couldn't let her death be swept under the rug. Melanie's guilt was palpable, but so was her fear. It had consumed her, but it was now my turn to be the strong one. I had to face the truth head-on, no matter how ugly it was. Jason was not going to get away with this. He had always thought that his lies and his power could protect him, but this time it was different. I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't going to let Chloe's death become just another unsolved tragedy, another quiet, forgotten moment in time. Not while I was still breathing. I would make sure he faced justice. And if it meant fighting against the very person I had once trusted, Melanie, then so be it. I couldn't let this remain hidden, not when the truth was so raw, so undeniable. It had been hidden for too long, buried beneath lies and manipulation, but now it was time to bring it to light. Jason thought he could continue living in the false light of innocence, pretending nothing had happened, that he was the victim in all of this. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not anymore. The fury inside me began to burn hotter with every passing day. The realization that my daughter had been killed, not by accident but by the recklessness of the very man I had once trusted, was something I couldn't let go. I had spent years pretending everything was fine, making excuses for him, allowing him to manipulate the narrative to fit his needs. But not this time. Not when it came to Chloe. I contacted the police, reached out with everything I had. I couldn't let fear hold me back anymore. Not fear of Jason, not fear of the consequences. He had already taken so much from me, from us. And now I was going to take control. I gave the officers every shred of evidence I could gather, every detail about that night. The lies he had told. The way he had tried to cover up the truth. It was all in front of me, and I was done being quiet. A mother's love knows no bounds. I had protected my children for years, but this was different. I was going to do whatever it took to ensure that justice was served for Chloe, even if it meant facing the man who had once been my partner, the man who had shattered everything I believed in. The police conducted a thorough investigation, digging deeper than I had ever imagined they would. At first, I had no faith that the system would work. Jason was too slick, too good at playing the role of the innocent victim, and the thought of him getting away with murder again haunted me. But then, the pieces began to fit together. The officers found not only that Jason had been behind the wheel that night, but they also uncovered signs of reckless driving. There were skid marks, a trail of carelessness that had been ignored, signs that Jason hadn't been as careful as he should have been. Chloe's death wasn't just some tragic accident. It wasn't a fluke of fate. It was the result of Jason's reckless disregard for everyone around him. His utter disregard for the consequences of his actions. And as the truth unfolded, as the investigation pieced together the story of that night, I couldn't help but feel a rush of anger, a rush of betrayal. Jason had taken Chloe's life with his selfishness, but he had also taken a piece of me with him. I couldn't just let it slip away into the past, forgotten, ignored. Chloe's death deserved more than that. The hardest part was yet to come. Melanie, my stepdaughter, the one person I thought I could trust, had known the truth all along. She had known what had happened. But she had stayed silent. And even though she had her reasons, fear, guilt, the manipulation of a man who had raised her, her silence weighed on me like 1,000 pounds. I had loved her like my own. She was my daughter in every sense that mattered. But she had betrayed me just as Jason had. But as the investigation continued, Melanie began to see the truth. The guilt that had plagued her for so long was too much to bear. She could no longer stand by Jason, no longer protect him, even if he had tried to manipulate her into believing she owed him her loyalty. The weight of what she had helped cover up was too much for her to ignore, and she finally cracked. She cooperated with the police, providing them with the details of that night that Jason had tried to bury. Every piece of information she gave, every truth she revealed, was another step toward the justice we all needed, even though it didn't feel like enough. I couldn't help but feel torn. My love for Melanie, the girl who had been like a daughter to me, was still there, but it had been cracked. The trust we once shared was gone. I could never forget what she had done, what she had chosen to keep hidden, even when she knew the cost. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the remorse I saw in her eyes, the weight of the decision she had made to finally speak up. She had made a choice to help me, to help Chloe. And though that didn't erase the past, it was a step toward the truth. All I needed now was justice. Chloe's life deserved to be acknowledged. Her death needed to mean something. Even if it was just to make sure Jason paid for what he had done. He couldn't keep hiding behind lies and manipulation. He couldn't keep thinking that he could escape the consequences of his actions. I wasn't going to let him. The battle ahead would be long and exhausting, filled with obstacles, but I wasn't going to stop. The system wasn't perfect, but it was the only way. Jason would have to face the consequences. No more hiding, no more pretending. This time I would fight for Chloe for the truth, and I would make sure Jason paid for what he had done. A month passed, and the news came. Jason had been arrested. The charges, manslaughter and unlawful conduct, felt like both a victory and a weight. The notification from the police arrived in my hands. And for a split second, a sense of relief washed over me. He was being held accountable for the death of my daughter, for the reckless act that had stolen her future, her laughter, her life. But as the relief settled in, it was quickly overtaken by the suffocating grief that had been lingering in the background all along. Chloe would never come back. No matter what Jason faced, no matter how long he was locked away, it wouldn't bring her back to me. That was the truth that I couldn't escape. No amount of justice could fill the hole in my heart. The emptiness where her presence once was. But still, there was something. A glimmer of satisfaction, however small. At least we had gotten justice for her. At least I had done everything in my power to make sure her life wasn't forgotten, that it meant something. The truth had been uncovered and Jason was finally facing the consequences of his actions. That at least was something I could hold on to. The day I stood in front of Chloe's grave was the hardest moment of my life. It felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on me. And I couldn't breathe. But in the midst of the overwhelming sadness, there was a strange kind of peace that settled over me. It wasn't the kind of peace I had expected. The kind where everything is okay, and the pain vanishes. No, this peace was different. It was a quiet acceptance, the understanding that I had done all I could. I had fought for my daughter, for the truth and for justice. I had confronted the wrongs and I had uncovered the secrets that had been buried for far too long. I had protected my family the best I could, and now, the pieces were finally falling into place. As I stood there, alone with my thoughts, I could feel the weight of everything we had endured. The lies, the betrayal, the pain of losing Chloe. It all rushed at me in a flood. And yet, there was a flicker of something else. I wasn't consumed by rage anymore. I wasn't drowning in sorrow. The anger and heartbreak were still there, lingering beneath the surface, but they no longer controlled me. They no longer had the power to define me. I had found a kind of peace, one I never thought was possible. It wasn't a perfect peace. And it didn't erase the grief, but it was enough to allow me to breathe again. To feel like I could move forward even if it was one slow step at a time. I no longer had to live under the shadow of Jason and his lies. I no longer had to constantly question myself or my decisions. I had done what I needed to do. I had fought for what was right. Melanie had started a new life too. I had seen her go through the same turmoil that I had, carrying the burden of guilt, wondering if there was a way to fix the damage she had helped cause. But just like me, she had come out the other side. The weight of her actions, the silence she had carried for so long, had been lifted. She had finally found a way to make peace with herself, and I could see it in her eyes. She was free of the guilt that had weighed so heavily on her. And though it didn't undo the damage, it allowed her to begin again. For the first time in a long time, I no longer carried the guilt either. I had done everything I could to protect my family, and I had made the right decisions no matter how hard they were. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't bring Chloe back, but I could ensure that justice had been served and that the truth was out. I had fought for her, and in some ways I had won. Though Chloe was gone, I still had my family. My children, the ones who had stood by me through it all, were still here. They still loved me, and I loved them more than anything. I had my children and my friends. The people who had never left my side, who had supported me when I had nothing left to give. And in that I found a sense of comfort. I wasn't alone. I wasn't broken beyond repair. Yes, I had lost Chloe, but I still had the love of those who remained. Life was never going to be the same. The void left by Chloe's absence could never be filled, and I didn't want it to be. She would always be a part of me, a part of us, and nothing could take that away. But I had learned something through all of this, through all the heartbreak and betrayal, that there is strength in the struggle. There is peace in the acceptance of what you cannot change. And there is healing in the love you still have left. And as I walked away from Chloe's grave that day, a bittersweet calm washed over me. I wasn't healed. I wasn't whole. But I was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, I was ready to live again, to keep moving forward, even if it was just one step at a time. After all the pain, after every tear shed, and every wound that had taken its toll, I found myself beginning to rediscover who I was. It was like peeling back layers that I had buried for years, layers of self-doubt, guilt, and pain. I had spent so long being defined by what Jason had done to me, by the shattered pieces of my past that I could never seem to put together. But now, I was learning that I was more than just the woman who had been hurt. I was more than the victim of betrayal. I started with small steps. I began walking every morning, feeling the cool air against my skin and letting the rhythm of my footsteps clear my mind. At first, it felt foreign, like I was going through the motions, but with each step, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking with the weight of someone else's mistakes on my shoulders. I wasn't walking with the burden of guilt or shame that had clouded my every decision before. It was just me, the path in front of me, and the sound of my breath. As I walked, I found myself thinking about the things I had never given myself the chance to do. For so long, I had put everyone else's needs before my own, thinking that if I just kept giving, I would find happiness. But the truth was, I had neglected myself. I had forgotten who I was outside of being Jason's wife, outside of being a mother who was constantly trying to fix things, trying to make everyone else happy. Now I was starting to remember. I was starting to feel the flicker of things I used to love before life had gotten so complicated. I joined art classes, something I had always wanted to do but never allowed myself to pursue. At first, it felt strange putting brush to canvas, making strokes without any expectations. But as I painted, I could feel the creativity flowing through me like a river that had been dammed for too long. It was freeing. I realized that I wasn't just painting pictures, I was painting my own sense of freedom, my own sense of identity. Each brushstroke was a release of the old self, a letting go of the parts of me that had been held back by fear and doubt. I explored hobbies I never thought I could have. I joined a local community group, something simple but new for me. I learned to cook dishes that weren't just for the sake of feeding others. For once, I was cooking for me, creating something that brought me joy, something that nourished my soul. Each day, I found new pieces of myself, pieces that had been buried under years of neglect and sacrifice. Pieces that I had forgotten were there. I was no longer the woman from my past. I wasn't the wife who endured betrayal, the woman who had been manipulated and hurt. I wasn't the mother who carried the weight of other people's mistakes, constantly feeling responsible for things that weren't mine to fix. I had shed all of that. Slowly, I began to realize that the woman who had survived it all, the hurt, the lies, the loss, was stronger than I had ever given her credit for. I had learned to love myself, and it was the kind of love that didn't need validation from anyone else. It was the love that came from within, the love that said, "You are enough." With each passing day, I felt stronger. I felt like I was reclaiming the parts of me that had been stolen or hidden away. I wasn't perfect and I didn't expect to be, but I was finally learning to live for myself. I was finally free of the shadows that had once consumed me. Melanie too had started a new life. She had her own journey to follow, but I could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the weight of her past actions had been lifted. She no longer carried the burden of her silence. She had made peace with herself, just as I was making peace with myself. We had both found a way to move on, to rebuild our lives, though the scars would always remain. We had to learn to live with them, but they didn't define us anymore. I found myself surrounded by my daughters, the people who had never stopped loving me, never stopped supporting me. We had all rebuilt our lives in our own way. We started each day with a sense of relief, with the understanding that the past was behind us. No more secrets. No more lies. We could breathe freely again. A new chapter had begun. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to move forward. Not just because I had to, but because I wanted to. I was no longer afraid of the unknown. I no longer feared the future, the things I couldn't control. I had spent so long feeling helpless, but now I understood that I had the power to create my own happiness, to make my own decisions. As I looked at the life I had built after everything, I felt a sense of pride. I wasn't the same person I had been when everything started. I had grown, I had healed, and most importantly, I had found my strength. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer walking it with fear in my heart. I was walking it with hope, with a sense of possibility, and with a renewed belief in myself. This story is a journey through betrayal, grief, and ultimately the hard-won freedom that comes with facing the truth. Sarah's loss was unimaginable. But in the midst of it all, she fought to reclaim her freedom and to secure justice for her daughter. The trials she endured couldn't erase the pain or the scars, but through it all, she found peace, a peace that was hard-earned but transformative. Now, I want to hear from you. How did Sarah's journey resonate with you? What did her fight for justice and healing make you think about your own life? Drop a comment below with your thoughts or reflections. If you felt moved by her story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this emotional journey. Together, Let's keep exploring the power of resilience and the strength that comes from within.